Katie Milfalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and I'm hoping today that you will bear with me. I'm doing a book because I like the topic of the person about whom this book is written. This is called, very lengthy title here, The Rule of Crime and Me, an intimate view of Anne Rule, shared by her friend of 30 years, Anne Jaeger. And look at this outfit now. For those of you who don't know, I can't imagine who the great Anne Rule was. She was a true crime writer, and she has since died. Very sad. All of my favorite authors are moving on. I discovered her fairly early in her career and have followed her avidly. I've got about half a bookshelf of her books that I've collected over the years. And when I saw this book, like thrift books, used, a couple bucks, I was like, oh, I have to read this. I had no intention of covering it here. And as I started to read it, I realized I really admired her and really loved her. And I'm going to indulge myself and talk about her. She was a great writer. She completely changed the genre of true crime writing. And the young woman who wrote this book knew her for years and years. They were friends. And this book is a little an homage to Anne Rule. It's in honor of what a great person she really was. And as one of my very favorite writers, I would like to honor her too. And, she wasn't a literary great. She didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. She probably would not be taught in a literature class, but she was a great writer. She was a compelling writer of a narrative flow that just drew you in. She wrote with a real heart, a connection to the emotion of the people involved. She wrote true stories, and so you could feel the humanity in her books. She was one of the first true crime writers and one of the early women who were true crime writers who bothered to think about the victims and their families, who avoided the blood and guts and talked about the psychology and the behaviors. That's what her books are really the greatest for. So let's talk about this, and I promise you by the time we're finished, you will love her too. First, I want to share one of my most cherished possessions. You're going to laugh at me. Let me see how much this cost. Okay, this cost $4.95. So there's a little story behind it. One day, a friend of mine called up and said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I had small children, and I said, "Well, I have small children." And she said, "Yes, but can somebody watch them? Guess who's coming to town to give a lecture?" Anne Rule. I went, "I don't care if I have to call Mary Poppins or leave them up with the TV to babysit." Yes, we didn't have a TV. Yes, I will be there. So I ran down to the bookstore because we were poor and I got all my books at the library. I didn't own a single Anne Rule book, but I'd read all the books she'd written so far. So they had one of her books left because everyone knew she was coming. It was going to be a sold out event. And so I bought the very last copy of the paperback, The Stranger Beside Me, about Ted Bundy. And I want to show you what I have right here. She signed it. Look at that. Signed by Anne Rule. I told my children if they give this book to Goodwill when I die, that I will haunt them. Okay, let us begin. This book is a very first person kind of a, how do I put this? Sort of an informal, that's not the right word. It's almost like a diary. It's just, she's just talking about her friend. And it moves around a bit, but there are many, many anecdotes in it that are they're really wonderful. So it was written in 2025. And chapter 1 is called The Rule of Crime. So she met Anne in court in 1984 at the trial of Diane Downs. Now, Denise and I have done a Psychics and Psychos on Diane Downs, a true psycho. Still, by the way, in prison, and just came up again for parole. Needless to say, she's still in prison. But this is the book that Anne Rule wrote about Diane Downs, Small Sacrifices. This was the most fascinating crime story. So well written, so insightful. Anne Jaeger. So I'm going to call her Jaeger because we have too many Anns in this story. Jaeger was a TV reporter, and she'd been given the job to go to this trial. So this is the 27-year-old mother who did away with her own children. It was a hideous story. So Jaeger gets to the trial late. She's been reporting. She's on television, doing reporting in front of the camera, doing research behind the camera. She gets there late and there is nowhere to sit. And she's kind of, high on her own supply. And she goes over and she recognizes Anne Rule because Anne Rule was known in those circles. But there was a young woman sitting next to Anne Rule, and she didn't recognize her as one of the media. So she went over to her and told her, these seats are for media only, excuse me. And it turned out it was Anne's daughter, Leslie, the same age as Jaeger. So interestingly enough, Jaeger and Leslie Rule were peers and should have been friends. And they got along beautifully. They got along very well. But there was a special bond, and it was a friendship bond, not a mother-daughter bond, between Anne Rule and Anne Jaeger that lasted for decades. So they were 27 years apart in age, she said, but they were close friends. At the time, her name was her unmarried name, Anne Bradley. And she was friendly with Leslie, she said, but she was closer to Anne for 31 years. Rule always remembered their first meeting, their first, as she puts it, inauspicious meeting, and got a big kick out of bringing it up in front of people and giving Jaeger a hard time for her bossiness at that first meeting. The author says this book is a love letter to Anne Stackhouse Rule. Selfless, she loved animals, she was loyal, she was a relentless researcher, fabulous writing skills, dedicated to her craft, just a remarkable person. So the chapters in this book reads really quickly. I'll be surprised if we actually make 2 full videos here, but I'm doing it anyway because it makes me happy. So chapter 2, Home Rule. She was born October 22nd, 1931. Interestingly enough, I started reading this book October 23rd. And when I got to this information, I thought, synchronicity. It's very interesting. She was born in Lowell, Michigan. Her parents were both teachers. Her father was self-made and very motivated. It was a very educated household. She said, my daddy always told me I was the prettiest little girl he'd ever seen. And she has his middle name. His name is her middle name. His name was Ray, R-A-E, and she was Anne Ray. Rule was an early talker, an early reader. There are pictures in the book of her, like at 3 or 4 years old, sitting reading a book to herself. So cute. I can't read my handwriting. This is really sad. Okay. Oh, I know. I skipped a sentence. It helps if you read the whole paragraph. So she was an early talker and reader. Her town was the quintessential American town. A lot of wealthy people because of the railroads, a lot of merchants, And it was sort of, that image of small town America. A lot of ornate Victorian style houses, painted bright colors. The town, she said, was the social hub of the county. So all the important county officials lived there. And the main business of the town, besides individual, businesses, was a button factory where they punched abalone shells out and made buttons out of them. They made 5 tons and freshwater mussels to make a ton. Okay. They used 5 tons of freshwater mussels in a month. So 5 tons of mussels in a month. The shells, they pressed the circles out of them to make the buttons. 1 ton of mussels made 210,000 buttons. That's incredible. This is, remember, pre-plastic. The mussels that were harvested for the shells, the actual animal, the mussel, they were fed to pigs. And she said the people in the area didn't understand that pork should not taste fishy. She said she talked to many people who grew up with her, and Anne Rule did, and they all expressed surprise when they had pork that was raised elsewhere because they thought all pork had a fishy taste to it. She also is not the only author that came from this little town in Michigan called Lowell. A guy called Howard Peckham, who wrote 21 books on colonial history. So if you're a historian, his name might mean something to you. And then this one, I think people might recognize, Charles Van Allsburg. He wrote Jumanji, and he wrote The Polar Express. I didn't know the same guy wrote those 2 books. He came from Lowell, Michigan. And she said the local library had a dedicated shelf to local authors, but there's no mention of Anne Rule, and so Jaeger saw to it that changed. She said true crime gets short shrift by snooty librarian types. Actually, I just had a conversation with Sarah, and it was really interesting because Sarah, who wrote Dorothy Kilgallen, because we got into talking about our favorite kinds of books. And it's interesting, what does a writer read? That was an interesting conversation. And this is a little tiny bit of the whole entire conversation that we had. I put her books, I put them too far away. I can't reach them, I'm sorry. Okay. Chapter 3, Anne, her first killer. Her maternal grandparents, her mother's family, they ran the Montcalm County Jail in the city of Stanton, Michigan. So this was what she called a mom and pop detention facility. The jail and the sheriff's residence were all in one continuous building, separated by a locked door, and that was it. Her grandfather was the sheriff, the cop in the county, and small county, and the jailer. Her grandmother booked in the criminals when they were arrested. She did the booking, and she cooked for them. When she cooked for the family, she also cooked for whoever was locked up in the jail. Anne's first killer was a woman by the name of Viola, and she never knew her last name. She remembered Viola obsessively crocheting, making a big lap blanket. And Anne at the time was 9 years old. And when she was visiting her grandparents, Viola was the prisoner of the day. And Anne, would bring her trays, deliver her meals. That was her job. And so she talked to her. And it confused Anne because all of the inmates, she said, were really, really nice to her. This is the one that really stands out. But they all talked to her and were very nice to her. There was only one hallway door that separated the jail cells from the family residence. There were 2 cells upstairs for women and for, as she put it, the insane. And then the male cells were downstairs in a wing next to the jail office. Anne delivered meals upstairs from a dumbwaiter. So her mother would put them in the dumbwaiter and haul them up. And Anne would go up the stairs and take them out of the dumbwaiter and present them to the women in the 2 cells. At 80 years old, Anne told the author Jaeger here that as a child, she loved sleeping in the empty cells when she visited her grandparents. If there was nobody incarcerated at the time, she would sleep in the women's cell. At a young age, she learned to view the accused as people who had made mistakes. That's the attitude her grandparents had. She didn't feel that they were scary. There was no sense of threat or harm. She said the only crime author, she said she was the only crime author who grew up in a jail next to killers. She had 2 cousins who also spent time in that jail. Anne's grandparents and then her aunt and uncle ran the jail. After her grandparents retired, her aunt and uncle ran it. But the cousins were not allowed to meet the incarcerated, and they were not allowed to go to the cells. So Anne had that unique opportunity. They did hear the drunks, they bring in people to sober up, put them in a cell. And even though the door was shut, they could hear them shouting and singing, crying, and foul language and all that. Her cousin became a social worker whose focus was children. Anne later told the story that she knew about Viola. She shot her husband when she caught him with her best friend in a Chevy truck that she bought for the husband with her tips as a waitress. So several layers of angst in that story. Viola told Anne that it was justifiable homicide and never trust women who pluck their eyebrows into those little itty bitty lines. She taught Anne how to crochet. The author Jaeger decided to investigate Viola to see if she could figure out if this was a real story or if Anne was making this up. Was it just entertaining? But she could not find the names of the inmates because when they were booked, they were listed as lodgers and not by their names, and probably because this was considered a holding facility. The formal holding for trial went on out of town, and so probably to a bigger town. And so they didn't get into a whole lot of detail in the paperwork at this jail. Anne later said, at the age of 7 or 8, I thought people chose what they wanted to be, and I didn't understand why someone would choose to go to jail. And at that young age, she was already into the psychopathology of criminal behavior. Viola claimed that it was justifiable, but Anne was smart enough, even at the age of 9. She knew that this was not an act of self-defense. Even as a child, she recognized Viola's stunning lack of remorse. She was very cold-blooded about it. Perfectly nice to Anne, not threatening to anybody, just matter-of-factly, I think of Chicago, the musical. He had it coming. That was her attitude. The author did find a similar story from 1940 in the jail. A woman named Joyce Earle, and she wonders, was her middle name Viola or was that her nickname? Because the story matched perfectly. Joyce was a secretary at a car body shop and part-time waitress, and she shot her husband. In 1940, Anne would have been 9 years old when this particular crime happened. And, Viola had told her that she bought the Chevy with her waitressing tips. Anne met Viola while visiting her grandparents during Easter vacation, and Joyce was in the jail during Easter vacation. She was the only woman there, so it all kind of fits. You can tell that Jaeger, the writer of this book, is an investigative journalist. So we'll never know for sure, but doubtless Anne met Joyce. In 1941, Joyce was released, and she ended up in the Pacific Northwest, close to where Anne ended up. And Joyce died in 1969. And Anne said, for sure, Viola's story set her on her writing path, that she was fascinated with this woman. Jaeger and Anne were obsessed with psychological triggers that drove murderers. Why do people do it? Why do they do what they do? And the conclusion that they both came to, and I think there's some truth to this, their minds work differently. The why kept Anne writing for more than 2 decades. Chapter 4, Rules, Roots. So shortly after meeting Viola, Anne's grandfather died. And this is very sad. He was revered in the county. He was a sheriff for many, many decades, and he never even took his gun out. He treated the inmates like people. He won every election he ever ran for. He was given a great deal of respect. He had been born in Copenhagen in 1874 in an area that was known for exporting butter. That there wasn't a lot of fertile soil, but they could raise cows, and their specialty was butter. He joined the army to save money because he wanted to go to America, and he didn't have quite enough money when he got out of the army, so then he became a miner in Greenland for 3 years. In 1898, he arrived at Ellis Island at the age of 24 with $12 in his pocket, and he got on a train to Montcalm, Michigan, because there were other Danes there. There was a little Danish community of Danish emigres, and so he decided to go there. It just blows my mind the remarkable amount of courage it takes. You don't speak the language. You only have $12. I mean, it's remarkable. He did masonry work when he got to Michigan. He met and married a German immigrant named Anna Cook, another Anna. And their firstborn was Anne Rule's mother. They had 6 children in all. The last one, a boy, died 1 day before his first birthday. It was some kind of weird bowel disorder, and it was very hard on the older sister, Sophie. Sophie had bonded with this baby, her little brother, and she never got over it. Now, Sophie was Anne's mother. So you've got the people from Denmark were her grandparents, and then there was her mother, was the older child, the older daughter of the family. In 1928, the family moved to Stanton, Michigan, and then he became the sheriff. Chapter 5, Ruling Stanton. Not only was her grandfather the sheriff and her grandmother the jailer, her aunt married the undersheriff, and in time he became sheriff. And her other uncle was the medical examiner, and her cousin was the prosecuting lawyer. They had the whole crime scene tied all up. As a child, she always begged to chase sirens. She always wanted to run down the street after the sirens. Her most precious keepsake was her grandfather's 1940 forensic science book. She always remembered the principle. Oh, here, I have to read it to you. I should put on my glasses. Every killer leaves something of himself at the scene and takes something away, no matter how minute. So this was kind of a novel concept at the time. I mean, it wasn't unheard of. It was known in crime circles. But to the general public and to a child, this was a mind-boggling concept that no matter where you go, you leave something. And this was way before DNA. But it gave her food for thought, let's put it that way. And she was really into forensics in her books. She said her grandfather, he might have been the sheriff, but he was really into brain over brawn. She saw herself as a psychological detective. She crawled inside the killer's minds to see what made him tick. And I would say that's why her books appeal to me, because that's exactly where my interest lies. You can read about violent crime, and then you get to the point where you don't really need to hear about the details anymore. That loses its horrifying fascination. What really sticks around is the motivation and behavior of the people involved. She was instilled early in life by her grandfather, who rejected force, using force against suspects. He didn't like the good cop, bad cop routine. He says, you don't need the bad cop. The good cop always gets the confession. and learned from him to let people talk and just listen with respect and not to be ruthless. And so Jaeger, the author, says maybe crime solving runs in families. The old logs show crimes that were not different back then than they are today. Abused wives had fewer choices. It was easier for the man to claim that, oh, this woman, crazy woman, it's hormones, she's insane. And like we mentioned, the sheriff never used his gun in 24 years. So here's one crime story from the logs, just to show that people don't change. Ben Perrier and Sylvia, they had a homestead farm on a small county lake at the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s. They didn't have children. They wanted children, but they didn't. So eventually they decided to foster. They fostered an 11-year-old boy. No, they fostered an 11-year-old girl first. The plot thickens. An 11-year-old girl whose mother just could not support her. And it was not unusual at the time for people who could not raise their children because they were too poor. They had no money. Put them in orphanages and adopt them out, put them in foster care. But it didn't work out. Not a whole lot of details. And she got taken back by social workers. So for 20 years, there were no children in the house. And then they fostered 11-year-old Robert. And one evening, while Ben was washing his face at the kitchen sink, 3 guys came in and shot him in the head. And Robert found his body on the ground in the kitchen. The sheriff came and started questioning Robert and quickly saw from the physical evidence that Robert's story was a lie. He used the sympathy approach. He was nice to Robert, lots of sympathy, and he got caught up in his lies. And Robert claimed that one of the intruders made him do the shooting. So the sheriff noticed that the dog's paw prints were outside in the snow, and he saw the dog, he could follow the paw prints to a bush, back and forth to a bush. So he figured out that the dog ran outside originally to chase something that was thrown and then went to find it under the bush, maybe bury it under the bush. And he went out and looked and he couldn't find anything under the bush, and he started following the dog paws in the snow, and he realized they came back in. So he paid attention to the dog, and the dog was under the bed, and he went under the bed and he found the family shotgun and a shell. The dog had been playing with the shell. So case solved by being quiet, being kind, sympathetic, and observant, paying attention. This was not a common approach, especially in those days, but it was always effective for the sheriff. He was humble. He told everybody the dog solved the case. At the time, many states allowed the execution of a minor for murder, but Robert was lucky. Hang on here. Criminologists of the day argued that death was a just retribution for unspeakable crimes, that it deters crimes, protects society, and preserves the moral order. But people of Michigan did not believe in executing killers of any age. They had no death penalty. So he served time in a, not rehab, but like a, what were they called? Reform school. So the sheriff was even more committed to that idea than most people. He wanted to know, why did this kid do this? The answer was from Robert that the old man hit me with a bucket. Well, who knows what the story was, but he went to reform school, and at 18, when he got out, he joined the military. And he was in the military his whole life. And Anne knew about this story, and she made the observation early on that he didn't go on to become a serial killer. He didn't kill anybody else the rest of his life, and that was an important fact. She was against the death penalty until her old age, when she started to believe that too many killers reoffended after they were released. The sheriff won his last election, but he soon resigned. It was too much for him, and he did die 6 months later. The town shut down for his funeral. It was the largest funeral ever in that part of the world, and he was called the father of Mount Calm County. His grandfather was very respected. Chapter 6, Rural Roams. So as a child, their family moved a lot because her father was a coach. And when you're a coach, you go with the team that hires you on. And that's always dependent on games that they win. So they moved 6 times in 15 years. And from childhood, Anne had been very spiritual. She believed in angels. She had a brush with death as a child, and she believed she survived because of the intervention of the angels. Her parents taught her to not judge people by race. And as a coach, her father deplored racism in the media coverage of sports, and he fought against it his whole life. Chapter 7. And I don't have details, I don't think, about what happened to her, why she almost died. I don't remember if it's later in the book, because I know you're probably wondering, because I know I am. I just don't remember. It's been a while since I read this. So chapter 7, Rural, Ann Arbor to Oregon. So her family settled in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where her father had a coaching job. And Anne discovered, the school tested everybody's eyes, and it was discovered that she was profoundly nearsighted, actually legally blind. I can relate to that. The family moved a number of times, and before she graduated from high school, and she was in Pennsylvania when she graduated from high school. This required that you had to have the ability to make friends fast, to catch up on gaps in educational systems, school to school, and to behave like you'd never met a stranger. It made her comfortable talking with people she didn't know. It was lonely for a child. She lost touch with her old friends. That was very difficult. She often felt like an outsider because she was always the new one. She learned to listen to other people's stories, though. It developed in her an ear for the narrative of other people. She said it helped to have a sense of humor. At 18, when she was 18, her dad got a new job in Oregon, but Anne actually went with them, but she didn't go home with them. She lived in the dorm. So she went to Willamette University to the dorm and not home, where her father was a coach there. The transition to the university was made easier because her parents lived right there on campus. They had a house. In 1949, only fewer than 2% of girls went to university. There's a statistic. Let me read that again. 1949, only 2%, fewer than 2% of girls went to university. Also, here's some stuff to think about. Were not allowed to have bank accounts. They were not allowed to draw a legal will. They could not buy or sell property, and they could not serve on a jury. If that makes you uncomfortable, it should. Unbelievable. She had to wear dresses, and there were dating rules. The school imposed these rules. This is hard to believe. When asked on a Coke date, which has a whole new meaning these days, like Coca-Cola date, do not order a banana split. The gold digger is soon shunned. Telephone a man only if necessary. He sees through a flimsy excuse, so you have cheapened yourself for nothing. Don't talk about the men in your life, real or imagined, like to this new guy. Talk about him, or better still, let him talk about him. Good God. Those were the rules that the university provided for the women in the school. Anne had a very individual style of dressing, and it made a big impression. She did it with a sense of humor, and she made friends, and she joined a sorority, and she made friends that remained her friends for the rest of her life. This Jaeger's book talks about her getting together with them throughout the decades and even into their 80s. She would read crime stories in the sorority house. She would read crime stories in the paper out loud to friends, but change the names of the people in the crime stories to the names of their friends. And they all thought that was hilarious. But remember, they didn't have a TV or the internet. One friend in her 80s had fond memories of dinners at Anne's parents' house because her father was the coach, and her parents were better known to her friends than you would expect because they were so close by. She'd bring her friends home, and they all loved her parents. They said their house was always fun, interesting conversations, and her mother was a fabulous cook. Anne's group of university friends remained a group for years. This is so lame. I'm sorry, but it's lame. I love her, but this is lame. They call themselves the Jolly Matrons. They stayed friends until they died. Chapter 8, The Rules of Engagement. In 1950, Anne transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle to major in creative writing and to focus on criminal justice, psychology, and penology, the study of prison punishment. She was drawn to the causes of crime, the psychology. She wanted to be a cop, not an author. She met her husband in writing class, and they married even though at first she thought he was dumb because he slept in class. What she didn't know was he was paying his way through college, and he worked all night at a gas station to pay tuition. He lived in a small boat on Lake Washington. It was not a houseboat. It was like a rowboat he slept in. It's just impossible. After graduation, Anne got a job as a cop. The first day, she was given the job of escorting a teenager to the hospital, and this teenage girl escaped from Anne's clutches from the exam room. And so that was an ignominious start to her career as a police officer. And then they put her on the vice squad, and she had to be the decoy as a sex worker. And 60 years later, she admitted how scared she had been because she was bait. And she had no weapon and no radio, no way to call for help if there had been a problem. So now she got hired as a provisional officer. She wasn't a full-fledged police officer until she'd taken the tests. They only offered them once a year. So if you showed up 2 weeks after the test had been administered, they might hire you provisionally. They'd let you do certain kinds of work, restricted. And then when the year rolled around and the test was offered again, then you took the test and you went on to be officially a cop. So she'd been hired provisionally. She needed to pass a series of tests. She had to wait a year to take the police exam. When she took the police exam, she aced it. She did great. She failed the eye test. So there's no such thing as contacts then, and you could not wear glasses as a police officer. She wasn't allowed. You needed to have 20/40 vision, and she had 2200. I can relate. So she couldn't have a career as a cop. This was a huge disappointment. This broke her heart. She'd had her heart set on this. For years after, she drove out of her way to avoid going past the public safety building where the cop shop was. She couldn't even pass the building without crying. But that 1 year was very valuable for her without her realizing it, because she made all these friends both in the higher up cops and in the people in her class. And she got all sorts of insider knowledge, how the system worked. And she made lifelong contacts and sources that served her well writing crime books. Chapter 9, Rule Happiness to Heartache. She became a social worker, and she, like her cousin, and she and her husband Bill decided to get married. Well, not her husband yet. She and Bill decided to get married in the family's church in Stanton, Michigan. The original 1874 church burned down in 1950, but it got rebuilt by Anne's wedding in 1954. 1 month before her 23rd birthday, they were married in Michigan. After the wedding, she was saying goodbye to her brother at the airport. She was returning to school. She knew she'd never see him again. He died a few months later at his own hands. This was a pivotal moment to lose her brother like that. It led her to volunteer on the Seattle Crisis Hotline, which was a hotline to help prevent that kind of thing. This is years later. She never fully recovered from the loss of her brother. It led her to work on the hotline, and that became a thing we'll talk about. Chapter 10, Family Rules. Her husband, Bill, was drafted. Korea, I think. They moved to New York for his training. He worked on an anti-aircraft battery. Oh, this was after the Korean War, but related, because that never really ended. He was transferred to Texas within 2 years, and eventually they had 4 children, one right after the other. This is interesting. Anne was really into natural childbirth and became the president of the Northwest chapter of the Natural Childbirth Society. I thought that was fascinating. After Bill left the Army, they lived in Bellevue, Washington, between 2 lakes, and Bill loved to swim. He was a very strong swimmer, probably a lucky thing because he used to live in a boat. Anyway, in 1962, there was the Seattle World's Fair, and her aunt and uncle and cousins came from Michigan. She was much older than her cousins. There's pictures of her, and here she is, this young woman in her 20s with a house full of children, and her cousins are kids, just family, generational age differences. They bought tickets to the fair. I asked my husband, how much do you think these tickets cost? Because we had just been marveling at the price of tickets to football games, I think it was, maybe soccer, just to the minimal seats, the not good seats were like $400 for one game. I'm like, are you kidding me? How do people afford to go? People have season tickets. People take their children. Were they donating an organ to afford to go to a game? I don't know. It's bizarre. Anyway, the tickets to the fair for the 62 World's Fair were $2, and kids paid $1. The big draw at this was a structure, a tower that looked very Jetson-y, very futuresque, called the Space Needle. And Anne would not let her children go up. Apparently you can go up in it, and she wouldn't let her kids go up. She was afraid of it. To help to support her family, and to be able to take time to write, she went door to door with products for people to test. So she worked for this company that tested products before they were fully on the market. So an example of one of the things that her job was to bring to people to test was Bugles snacks, those little cone-shaped things. And her kids hated them. After 6 years of writing and getting rejections, she got $35 for 2 articles in a Seattle Sunday magazine. The next year, she made $107. And by year 8, she made 1,000. She got printed in the New York Daily News and the Chicago Tribune. So it took 8 years of writing before she got even a decent amount of money, but she was intrepid and she just kept at it. She knew the chances of becoming a book author were slim, that you only had a 0.1% shot at making it. And she told other newbies, you can't let the naysayers make you think that you can't make it, because you can. She took her own advice and she did start overcoming the odds, but this wasn't something that just fell in her lap. She worked really hard with no pay or virtually no pay for a very long time before she really made it in crime writing. So she started out writing true stories for detective magazines, and she had a nom de plume, a writer's name, calling herself Andy Stack, because the male editors told her that readers did not believe a woman could know anything about police investigations in the 60s. Finally, they realized she knew far more than the male writers did, and she decided to keep her nom de plume to avoid unwanted visitors from criminals. She wrote for 5 True Detective magazines in their heyday. They cost 35 cents a piece, and they were the kind, I don't know if you remember these. I remember these. They had lurid covers of half-dressed women in these terribly threatened scenarios on the cover. Staged, crime scene covers, and a wide circulation nationally. They were very, very popular. She hated the covers, and she thought they were salacious and the headlines were salacious, and she begged the editors to change all that. But the lurid spin that they were given, that's what sold issues. She wrote 2 or 3 articles a week, 10,000 words or 30 pages each, for 13 years. That is self-discipline. She honed her criminal profiling skills. She honed her expertise on violent offenders. She gained full access to the Seattle detectives. They liked her, they knew her, they told her anything, and then they let her look at their files. Before the detective magazine, she got published in confession magazines, True Confessions. These stories might be loosely based on reality, but they were fictionalized. They had a formula. There's a sin, and the people suffer, and then they repent. For True Confessions, she took true fact, conjugal visits in prison that were established something new. She embroidered the story. She entitled it, I Went to Prison to Sleep with My Sister's Husband. It got popular attention. She wrote until she said, I ran out of things to confess. She wrote all of this with 4 children at home. She said as long as the kids were not fighting on top of the typewriter, she could write. She had incredible powers of concentration. And finally, she started getting a regular, approximately $250 an article. There were a total of 1,400 magazines with her byline. And in 1969, she became a full-time writer. There were 4 topics that were taboo for her. She would have nothing to do with them. Torture, motorcycle clubs, and mob crime families and drug rings she widely avoided, courting retaliation. Meanwhile, her husband Bob worked full-time, but he longed to write the great American novel. He wrote a short story. This does not sound intriguing. He wrote a short story that appeared in the Michigan Quarterly, which is a very respected literary magazine at the time. The name of the story was Leo the Christian Lifeguard, but he never sold his novels. Anne made a conscious decision to write trash so as not to compete with her husband's writing aspirations. He eventually quit working at Boeing, where that was his job, his day job, because he found it mind-numbing. He became a high school teacher. Then he was unfaithful. Then the marriage crumbled. And in 1971, they were working out the terms of the divorce when he was diagnosed with melanoma. The divorce was final in 72, and this is after 20 years of marriage already. He began dating a girl 19 years younger than he. And despite this, wife Anne still remained close to Bill, and the young girl, she called her, his second wife, her wife-in-law, because now that she was a single parent, she had to quit volunteering on the crisis line, and she wrote more. It was hard to keep the children and to cope with the eventual death of their dad 4 years later, you know, keep raising them without any help. And then he died 4 years later, and they were traumatized. In the 70s, she still had two teenage boys at home. She was the sole breadwinner. She got asked to do a treatment for a movie, The Lords of Flatbush. The guy who was doing it, he read one of her crime articles in Cosmopolitan. So she ended up helping the director, Martin Davidson, to write the script while living in the Ambassador Hotel in California. It's where Kennedy was shot, Robert Kennedy. Her children stayed back home with friends for 7 months. And nothing really came of the script, and she finally just packed up and went back home. But she did use the crime that was in the story of the script. She did use it in one of her books. But it's a true story. By the 1980s, she had begun cranking out crime books that were very popular paperbacks under the name Andy Stack. She had a good nose for compelling stories that other people overlooked. She was really into the psychological aspect of it. She searched for attractive, seemingly successful killers, people who didn't look like murderers. Quote, "I'm looking for a protagonist who seemed to have everything: physical attractiveness, intelligence, charisma, education, money, love, fame, all of those things that most of us think, well, if I had that, I'd be happy. Yet the people I choose have those things, but they're empty inside. They're sociopaths, so they always want more." And her eye for crimes turned the 1980s into a prolific decade for her. So let's see here. Where am I? This is exactly what made this book so compelling, The Stranger Beside Me. This is the story of Ted Bundy. She got a contract to write about the unknown local serial killer who called himself Ted, as overheard by eyewitnesses. And she was working at this time, back at it, working on the hotline, the crisis hotline. And it was in a house, you know, that was an office building now. She worked 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and they would pair people up. And she was paired up with a young man who was studying law. His name was Ted, and he worked from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., so their shifts overlapped. And they had this Sunday through Tuesday. They worked together at night, and they had this sort of system going. She would take the calls, and she would calm down the upset person. And he would use the other phone and try to trace the calls for the police to go and intervene. They saved lives. They did a good job. So she met Ted Bundy. That's who Ted Bundy was her partner Ted on the hotline. So she used this book. She used this knowledge of him, and they were friends. You know, they weren't friends outside the hotline, but they were friendly. She thought he was a nice guy. I actually got to ask her a question. She mentioned that part of what was so shocking is she trusted him. He's just a perfectly nice guy. And he would volunteer to walk her daughters to their car at night. The daughters would come to visit her at the hotline. And Anne would say, well, wait for me. I don't want you going out there alone. And he would say, oh, I'll walk them to their car. And I asked her in retrospect, do you freak out when you think about that? And she said no, because he didn't kill people that knew him, that he was familiar with. Part of the thrill for him was a stranger. So the book was written from the perspective of the killer's friend, Anne, about her internal struggle. And it talked about how she felt about having been friendly with this guy, trying to wrap her head around what he did. It was the first true crime book since 1966 in cold blood to have the kind of impact that it did. It was one of a kind book. It took a while to get hot, to get popular. But when it did, it really did. It took a while to get known outside of her area in the Pacific Northwest. In 1981, she also wrote her first novel called Possession, about a woman held captive by a stranger who rescued her from an accident that kills her husband, and then she finds herself trapped. It caused a big stir. It was banned in Connecticut. There were some risque parts in it, and her aunts took issue with it because they were very genteel. They objected to the swearing in it. It wasn't the behaviors, it was the swearing. They said, we don't use those terms. But her family gave her unwavering support. All her books made the New York Times bestseller list. So I'm going to stop here, the end of this chapter, and I hope you're enjoying this. I am so fond of her and so fond of her writing. And as she as a person was such a wonderful person that I find myself just happy to read about her. So there's the end of video 1, and we'll start video 2 here, and I hope you're enjoying it. And be careful of young men named Ted who volunteer next to you. Slung foil, slancha.